"Stop!" bellows the wealthy rancher as dust swirls around the trembling girl, her small body crumpled beneath the boots of snarling settlers who kick and curse while her desperate mother pleads from her knees. The townsfolk expect the mountain of a man to simply ride past. After all, rich men don't dirty themselves with the affairs of the downtrodden. They assume the child will endure this brutality in silence, forgotten like all the others before her. But the giant cowboy foreman watches from his saddle, sensing something different stirring in his employer's weathered face. Unknown to the crowd, the girl carries a secret that could shatter the rancher's carefully constructed world, while the mother harbors a truth that binds their fates in ways that could destroy or redeem them all. Will the rancher risk everything he's built to save a child who may hold the key to his own salvation? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as Ezekiel Morrison guided his horse down the dusty main street. The wealthy rancher made this monthly supply run like clockwork, his presence commanding respectful nods from shopkeepers and cautious glances from the struggling homesteaders. The town buzzed with a different energy today. Clusters of weather-beaten settlers huddled in heated conversations outside the general store. Their faces bore the strain of another failed harvest, another month of watching their dreams crumble in the unforgiving Wyoming dirt. Thomas Garrett stood at the center of the largest group, his voice carrying across the street. The charismatic settler had arrived 6 months ago with grand promises of prosperity. Now he channeled the community's desperation into something darker. "We came here to build something," Garrett declared to his growing audience. "We didn't come here to watch outsiders take what's rightfully ours." Zeke dismounted near the hitching post, his weathered hands securing the reins. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from owning the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties. Yet beneath that composed exterior, loneliness ate at him like a persistent ache. The memory of his daughter Sarah still haunted him. She had died of fever 3 winters ago, taking with her the last remnants of joy. She provided quality work at fair prices, earning the trust of ranchers and townspeople who could afford her services. This success made her a convenient scapegoat for the community's frustrations. "There she goes again," one settler muttered, "acting like she owns the place." Ruby looked up at her mother with concerned eyes. The intelligent child understood more than most adults realized. She had learned early that their survival depended on maintaining dignity in the face of cruelty. Sam Hayes, Zeke's ranch foreman, rode up behind his employer. The loyal cowboy had worked the Morrison Ranch for 15 years, watching his boss retreat further into isolation after each personal loss. Sam noticed everything, including the way Zeke's jaw tightened whenever he witnessed injustice in town. "Supplies won't take long today, boss," Sam said, reading the tension in the air. Zeke nodded, but his attention had shifted to the growing commotion near the church. Garrett's voice rose above the murmur of his followers, painting Esther as a threat to their way of life. The rancher had seen this pattern before in other frontier towns. Desperation bred hatred, and hatred needed a target. "She's taking food from our children's mouths," Garrett continued, his words carefully chosen to inflame rather than inform. "While we struggle to survive, she prospers. Ask yourselves why." The crowd's energy shifted from frustration to anger. Several men stepped forward, emboldened by Garrett's rhetoric. Their faces hardened with the dangerous resolve of people who had nothing left to lose. Esther sensed the change immediately. She quickened her pace, pulling Ruby closer. They needed to reach the safety of their small home behind the laundry building, but Garrett's followers had already begun moving to intercept them. "Where do you think you're going?" one of the settlers called out. Esther stopped, her heart racing. Ruby pressed against her side, the book trembling in her small hands. The child's courage never wavered, but she was still just 8 years old, facing grown men filled with misplaced rage. "Please," Esther said quietly, "we don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Garrett approached with calculated menace. "The trouble started when you decided our community wasn't good enough." Shove sent Esther stumbling backward. She tried to shield Ruby, but the circle closed tighter. When the kicks began, they were aimed at the small girl whose only crime was existing in a world that had already decided she didn't belong. Ruby cried out as boots found their mark. Esther's desperate pleas echoed off the wooden storefronts as she threw herself between her daughter and the attackers. The book Ruby had been carrying scattered its pages across the dusty ground, each page a small dream trampled underfoot. Zeke's hands clenched into fists. The sound of Ruby's frightened sobs cut through him like a blade, awakening something he had buried with his own daughter's death. This child's pain called to his own grief, demanding he choose between comfortable inaction and dangerous intervention. The moment stretched between heartbeats, heavy with consequence and choice. The thunder of hooves broke through the crowd's cruel laughter. Zeke spurred his horse forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the attackers. The settlers stumbled backward as the wealthy rancher dismounted with deliberate authority. "Enough!" His voice carried the weight of 15 years commanding respect in this territory. The men who had been so bold moments before now shuffled their feet like scolded children. Money talked in frontier towns, and Zeke Morrison had more than anyone within 100 miles. Garrett stepped forward, unwilling to let his moment slip away. "This doesn't concern you, Morrison. We're handling community business." Zeke's cold stare silenced him. The rancher had faced down rustlers, wolves, and blizzards that could kill a man in minutes. A frustrated settler with delusions of leadership posed no threat. Ruby lay curled on the ground, her small body shaking with pain and fear. Esther knelt beside her daughter, checking for serious injuries while tears streamed down her dirt-stained cheeks. The sight struck Zeke like a physical blow. "Get back to your homes," he commanded the crowd. "All of you." The settlers dispersed reluctantly, their bloodlust replaced by the practical fear of crossing the most powerful man in the county. Only Garrett lingered, his face twisted with rage at being denied his moment of dominance. "This isn't over," Garrett muttered before stalking away. Sam remained mounted. His hand hurt it too. "She's hurt," Esther said quickly. "Sometimes children say strange things when they're scared." But Zeke wasn't listening to her explanation. Something about Ruby's face had captured his attention completely. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her small nose, even the way her hair curled at the temples. Familiarity tugged at memories he had tried to bury. "We need to get her somewhere safe," he said, lifting Ruby with surprising tenderness. The child weighed almost nothing in his arms. She reminded him achingly of Sarah at that age, all stubborn courage wrapped in a fragile frame. Ruby's head lolled against his shoulder as consciousness faded in and out. Sam led the way to Esther's small home behind the laundry building. The modest space was spotlessly clean, with hand-sewn curtains and carefully tended flowers in the window boxes. Books lined a makeshift shelf, more volumes than most frontier homes possessed. Zeke laid Ruby on the narrow bed, while Esther hurried to gather medical supplies. Her movements were efficient, practiced. This wasn't the first time she had tended injuries caused by the town's hostility. "She needs a doctor," Zeke said. "The doctor won't come here," Esther replied quietly. "Not for us." The simple statement carried years of accumulated pain. Zeke understood immediately. Dr. Harrison served the white families in town, the respectable people who could afford his services and whose social standing made them worthy of his attention. Zeke began cleaning Ruby's wounds with gentle precision. Ranch life had taught him basic medical care out of necessity. Injured animals and hurt ranch hands couldn't wait for doctors who might never come. As he worked, his eyes kept returning to Ruby's face. The resemblance that had struck him earlier grew stronger with each passing moment. When he moved her sleeve to examine a bruised shoulder, he stopped breathing entirely. A small birthmark, shaped like a crescent moon, marked her upper arm, identical in size, shape, and position to one his late wife had carried. The same mark that had always fascinated him during their brief marriage. "Esther." His voice came out rough, strained. "We need to talk." She met his eyes and saw recognition dawning there. The secret she had guarded, a world that saw her as less than human. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question carried no anger, only a pain so deep it threatened to break him. Esther sank into the chair beside the bed, her composure finally cracking under the weight of years of silence. "What could I have told you? That the respectable Ezekiel Morrison had a child with his seamstress? That your arranged marriage and social standing would be destroyed by the truth?" He wanted to argue, to insist he would have done the right thing. But honesty forced him to confront the man he had been 8 years ago. Young, concerned with reputation, trapped in a marriage designed to increase his land holdings rather than his happiness. "She's brilliant," Esther continued, pride breaking through her tears. "She reads at a level far beyond her age. She remembers everything she hears. Sometimes I think she's too smart for her own good." Ruby stirred on the bed, her eyes opening more clearly now. She looked between the two adults with the unsettling perception children sometimes possessed. "Mama," she said softly, "is the angry man gone?" "Yes, sweetheart. You're safe now." But even as Esther spoke the comforting words, all 3 adults in the room understood the lie. Safety was an illusion in a world where hatred could gather a crowd and turn neighbors into enemies. Today's intervention had bought them time, nothing more. Ruby's gaze settled on Zeke with curious intelligence. "You helped us." "Yes," he said simply. "Thank you." 2 words from his daughter's lips, and Ezekiel Morrison's carefully ordered world crumbled completely. 3 days passed before Zeke returned to the modest home behind the laundry building. He came after dark, when prying eyes couldn't document his visits. The weight of newfound fatherhood pressed heavy on his shoulders as he knocked softly on the door. Ruby answered, her bruises fading to yellow patches on her brown skin. She had been reading by candlelight, a thick volume of poetry spread across the small table. At 8 years old, she consumed literature like other children devoured candy. "Mr. Morrison," she said formally, stepping aside to let him enter. The politeness stung. His own to cut through adult complications and reach the heart of matters. Ruby sensed the undercurrents swirling around her, but lacked the context to understand them fully. Zeke settled into the chair across from her, studying the face that was becoming more familiar with each encounter. "I did know your mother. She worked at my ranch house years ago. Were you friends?" The innocent question struck like a blade between his ribs. Friends. Such a simple word for the complex relationship that had produced this remarkable child. They had been much more than friends during those stolen months before his arranged marriage destroyed everything. "Yes," he said finally. "We were friends." Ruby nodded solemnly, filing the information away in her extraordinary memory. She returned to her book, but Zeke noticed her attention remained partially focused on the adult conversation happening around her. "I brought supplies," he said to Esther, gesturing toward the packages Sam had quietly delivered to the back door. The food and medicine represented more than practical assistance. They were Zeke's first tentative steps toward accepting responsibility for the family he had unknowingly abandoned. Esther accepted them with gratitude, mixed with wariness. Over the following weeks, a careful routine developed. Zeke would arrive after sunset, bringing books for Ruby and supplies for the household. He began teaching his daughter mathematics and history, marveling at her ability to absorb complex concepts with ease. Ruby's intelligence went far beyond simple memorization. She possessed an analytical mind that could break down problems and find creative solutions. When presented with a particularly challenging arithmetic problem, she would work through it methodically, often discovering shortcuts that impressed even Zeke. "She gets that from you," Esther observed one evening, watching Ruby tackle a geometry lesson designed for children twice her age. The pride in her voice was unmistakable. Despite the circumstances that had separated them, Esther harbored no bitterness toward Zeke. She understood the social realities that had made their relationship impossible 8 years ago. But Cedar Ridge's social realities were shifting in dangerous directions. Thomas Garrett had not forgotten his public humiliation or abandoned his campaign against Esther's family. The failed confrontation had only made him more cunning in his approach. Rather than organize almost immediately, several longtime customers stopped bringing their laundry, offering weak excuses about changed circumstances. Others paid their bills but avoided eye contact, treating her with the cold disapproval reserved for fallen women. Ruby noticed the changes before anyone told her. Her brilliant mind cataloged the subtle shifts in customer behavior, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the suspicious glances that followed them through town. "People are acting strange," she told her mother one afternoon. Esther had been dreading this conversation. Ruby's intelligence made it impossible to shield her from harsh realities for long. The child would figure out the truth eventually, and lies would only damage the trust between them. "Some people don't like that we're doing well," Esther explained carefully. "They think we don't deserve success." "Because of how we look?" The direct question caught Esther off guard. Ruby had inherited more than intelligence from her parents. She possessed an uncomfortable ability to identify the real motivations behind people's actions. "That's part of it," Esther admitted. Ruby absorbed this information with the same methodical approach she applied to her studies. She was learning that the world operated according to rules that had nothing to do with fairness or logic. Her skin color and family circumstances marked her as different, and difference made some people angry. Meanwhile, Sam had begun noticing changes in his employer's behavior. Zeke seemed distracted during ranch work, his thoughts clearly focused elsewhere. The foreman's loyalty ran deeper than simple employment, and he worried about whatever secret was consuming his boss. "Everything all right?" Sam asked one evening as they finished the day's tasks. Zeke considered sharing the truth about Ruby, but the implications were too complex for a simple conversation. Sam deserved an explanation, but the timing wasn't right. Too many variables remained unsettled. "Just town business," Zeke replied, which was technically accurate if incomplete. But Garrett's campaign was escalating beyond mere gossip. He had begun recruiting settlers from neighboring communities, men who didn't know Esther personally, but were willing to accept his version of events. These outsiders brought fresh anger and fewer scruples about how they expressed it. Late one night, someone to make. Protecting Ruby and Esther meant confronting not just Garrett's growing mob, but the social structures that gave men like Garrett power in the first place. The time for half measures was ending. The shattered glass crunched under Zeke's boots as he surveyed the damage to Esther's home. Ruby sat quietly in the corner, salvaging pages from her destroyed books with the methodical precision that marked everything she did. Her calm reaction to the violence troubled him more than tears would have. "We can't keep living like this," Esther said, sweeping glass fragments into a pile. Zeke understood the weight behind her words. The attacks would continue escalating until someone got seriously hurt. Garrett's campaign had moved beyond intimidation into outright terrorism, and the local sheriff seemed conveniently absent whenever trouble found Esther's family. "I have an idea," Zeke said, "but it requires taking a significant risk." He had spent the previous week considering his options, drawing on years of experience dealing with rustlers and claim jumpers. The key to defeating men like Garrett was understanding their true motivations. They always revealed themselves eventually if you gave them enough rope. Sam arrived at the ranch house the next morning to find his boss hunched over a collection of mechanical parts spread across the dining room table. The device looked like a cross between a music box and a telegraph machine, all brass cylinders and delicate springs. "What in the world is that contraption?" Zeke looked up from the assembly instructions, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. Edison phonograph. Had it shipped from Denver. Supposed to record and play back sound. The foreman examined the device with the skepticism of a man who had seen too many newfangled inventions fail spectacularly in frontier conditions. "What do you need it for? Remember those cattle thieves we caught last year? The ones who thought they were too smart to get caught?" Sam nodded, beginning to understand his employer's thinking. They had successfully exposed a rustling operation by documenting the thieves' own words, using their arrogance against them. Zeke was planning something similar for Garrett. "Men like him can't help bragging about their schemes," Zeke continued, carefully adjusting the phonograph's recording mechanism. "Especially when they think nobody important is listening." The plan required patience and precise timing. Children initially kept their distance, influenced by their parents' attitudes. But Ruby's genuine kindness and obvious intelligence gradually broke down barriers that hatred had tried to build. She helped struggling students with their reading, shared her own books, and never responded to cruelty with cruelty. "She's changing minds," Esther told Zeke during one of his evening visits. "Slowly, but it's happening." They watched through the window as Ruby played a simple game with two younger children whose parents had initially forbidden any interaction. The children's laughter carried across the yard, a sound of hope in an increasingly tense situation. "She has your wife's gift for seeing the best in people," Esther added quietly. Zeke felt the familiar pang of loss mixed with newfound pride. His daughter was demonstrating a moral courage that put most adults to shame. She faced each day's challenges with dignity and tact, refusing to let hatred diminish her spirit. But Garrett's frustration with Ruby's quiet success was pushing him toward more desperate measures. The settlers' original plan to drive out one family had evolved into something larger and more dangerous. He began speaking about cleansing the entire territory of undesirable elements. "They multiply like rabbits if you let them," Garrett told his core followers during a clandestine meeting behind the blacksmith shop. "Give them an inch today, they'll take a mile tomorrow." Unknown to Garrett, Zeke crouched in the shadows with his phonograph, carefully recording every poisonous word. The mechanical device captured not just the content of the conversation, but the malicious tone that revealed the speaker's true character. The recordings grew more damning over several nights of surveillance. Garrett spoke freely about his plans to frame Esther for theft, his scheme to claim Zeke's ranch through legal manipulation, and his broader vision of establishing a community based on racial purity. "Morrison's gotten soft," Garrett's voice emerged clearly from the phonograph during playback. "All that money made him forget which side he belongs on. Time to remind him." Sam listened to the recordings with growing anger. He had suspected Garrett's true nature, but hearing the man's actual words stripped away any remaining doubt about the threat they faced. "This is enough to destroy him," Sam said after hearing the most incriminating segments. Against its creator. The settler's arrogance would be his downfall, but only if Zeke was prepared to risk everything he had built. "There's something else," he told Sam. "Something I need to tell you about Ruby." The foreman had been waiting months for this conversation. He had observed too many meaningful glances and unexplained emotions to believe his employer's involvement was purely charitable. "She's my daughter." Sam absorbed this revelation without visible surprise. It explained everything he had witnessed, from Zeke's protective instincts to his willingness to risk his reputation for a child most people would ignore. "What are you planning to do about it?" "What I should have done 8 years ago." The admission carried the weight of accumulated regret and newfound determination. Zeke had spent years hiding from difficult truths, but Ruby's courage was teaching him that some things were worth any risk. The town meeting was 3 days away. 3 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine not just his family's future, but the moral direction of the entire community. The Cedar Ridge Church Hall buzzed with anticipation as townspeople filed in for Garrett's promised revelation. The settler leader had spent days building excitement for his presentation, promising evidence that would expose the corruption threatening their community's moral foundation. Zeke entered through the back door, the phonograph concealed in a canvas bag under his arm. Sam followed closely, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. They had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but the reality felt different, surrounded by hostile faces and crackling tension. Esther sat near the front with Ruby beside her, both dressed in their finest clothes. The 8-year-old held herself with remarkable composure, despite the whispers and stares directed their way. Her presence served as a silent challenge to anyone who claimed moral authority while targeting children. Garrett commanded the makeshift podium with theatrical flair, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. He had cultivated his image carefully over the months, positioning himself as the defender of traditional values against outside corruption. "Friends, neighbors," he began, "we gather tonight to address a cancer growing in our midst." The crowd leaned forward eagerly. Frontier life offered few entertainments, and public accusations challenged legally. Zeke remained motionless in the back corner, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his trap. The phonograph sat ready, its brass cylinder loaded with the most damning recordings he had collected. Everything depended on timing and Garrett's predictable arrogance. "I have proof," Garrett declared, producing a folder of documents. "Evidence of theft, manipulation, and moral corruption that reaches the highest levels of our society." The forged papers looked authentic enough to fool casual examination. Garrett had invested significant effort in creating his false evidence, complete with official-looking seals and carefully practiced signatures. His plan required destroying Esther's reputation so thoroughly that no future defense would be credible. "This woman," he pointed dramatically at Esther, "has been stealing from the families who trusted her with their belongings. Jewelry, money, personal items disappearing from homes where she worked." Gasps filled the room as people absorbed the accusations. Several customers who had employed Esther's services looked shocked and betrayed. The psychological impact was exactly what Garrett had calculated. "But that's not the worst of it," he continued, building toward his crescendo. "She's been using her stolen wealth to corrupt our most respected citizens, buying protection through methods I dare not describe in mixed company." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Without stating anything explicitly, Garrett had painted Esther as both thief and prostitute, crimes that would destroy any woman's standing in frontier society. Ruby gripped her mother's hand tighter, her intelligent eyes recognizing the trap closing around them. She had read enough books to understand how accusations could become truth through repetition, regardless of evidence. "Furthermore," Garrett's voice rose triumphantly, "I have witnesses who will testify to seeing money change hands between this woman and certain wealthy ranchers who shall remain nameless for now." Zeke felt the room's attention shift toward him like a physical weight. Garrett's strategy was masterfully executed, allowing the audience to draw their own conclusions while maintaining plausible deniability about direct accusations. "The time has come," Garrett declared, "to cleanse our community of this corruption before it spreads further." protectively. Garrett's confident expression faltered as he realized his carefully orchestrated presentation was being interrupted. "I don't know what you're talking about, Morrison." "I think you do." Zeke placed the phonograph on the podium, its brass and steel construction gleaming in the lamplight. Most of the audience had never seen such a device, adding to their confusion and anticipation. "This machine records sound," Zeke explained to the room. "Mr. Edison's latest invention. Very useful for documenting conversations people think are private." Garrett's face went pale as understanding dawned. The settler leader's eyes darted toward the exits, but Sam's presence and the packed room made escape impossible. "You can't prove anything," Garrett said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Zeke activated the playback mechanism. The phonograph's mechanical voice filled the silent room with perfect clarity, reproducing Garrett's own words from his clandestine meetings. "They multiply like rabbits if you let them. Give them an inch today, they'll take a mile tomorrow." The crowd shifted uncomfortably as they heard their supposed moral leader's true opinions. The voice was unmistakably Garrett's, captured in moments when he thought only his closest allies were listening. Morrison's gotten soft. All that money made him forget which side he belongs on. Time to remind him. More damning segments followed. Garrett's admission of planning to plant stolen goods in Esther's home. His scheme to forge legal documents claiming portions of Zeke's ranch. His vision of driving out anyone who didn't meet his standards of racial purity. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as people realized how completely they had been manipulated. Garrett's moral authority crumbled with each recorded revelation, exposing him as a calculating fraud who had used their legitimate grievances to fuel his personal hatreds. "Ladies and gentlemen," Zeke said as the recordings ended, "you've heard the truth about your would-be leader." But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The silence in the church hall stretched like a held breath as Garrett's recorded voice faded into mechanical stillness. Faces that had, moments before, shown eager anticipation now reflected shock and shame. The man they had trusted to voice their frustrated community he claimed to represent. Several of Garrett's former supporters edged away from him, their faces burning with embarrassment at how easily they had been manipulated. The settlers' grand crusade stood exposed as nothing more than calculated hatred wrapped in righteous language. But Zeke wasn't finished. The moment had arrived for the revelation that would transform everything, not just for tonight, but for the future of his family. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned assembly. "Something about why I've been protecting Esther and Ruby." Esther's eyes widened as she realized what was coming. They had never discussed this moment, never planned for the public revelation that would change all their lives forever. Ruby looked up at her mother with growing understanding, her brilliant mind already grasping the implications. Zeke walked to where they sat, his weathered hands gentle as he helped Ruby to her feet. The 8-year-old stood with quiet dignity, unafraid despite the dozens of eyes focused on her small frame. "This child," Zeke said clearly, "is my daughter." The words hit the room like thunder. Gasps and shocked murmurs erupted from every corner as people struggled to process this unexpected confession. The wealthy rancher's protection of the Laundress family suddenly made perfect sense, while simultaneously overturning every assumption about their relationship. Ruby looked up at Zeke with eyes that held no surprise, only acceptance. Her exceptional intelligence had already pieced together the clues over their weeks of secret meetings. She had been waiting for the adults to acknowledge what she had already figured out. 8 years ago, Zeke continued, I was a different man. Too concerned with reputation, too afraid of what people might think. I let fear keep me from acknowledging the best thing that ever happened to me. His voice carried the weight of accumulated regret and newfound determination. The confession represented more than admitting paternity. It was a complete rejection of the social structures that had kept his family divided. "Ruby is brilliant, kind, and brave," he said, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. "She's everything a father could hope for in a child. I'm proud to claim her, and I'm ashamed it took me that." His accusations now sounded like the ravings of a discredited fraud. Ruby stepped forward then, her small voice carrying with surprising strength in the hushed room. "Mr. Garrett, why do you hate people so much?" The simple question from a child cut through layers of adult complexity to reach the heart of the matter. Ruby's direct gaze held no accusation, only genuine curiosity about the motivations behind such determined cruelty. Garrett fumbled for a response that never came. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that her very existence threatened his vision of the world? How could he justify hatred to someone who had never responded to cruelty with anything but dignity? "A wise man once wrote that we should love our neighbors as ourselves," Ruby continued, her voice gaining confidence. "I think that means all our neighbors, not just the ones who look like us." The biblical reference struck home in a room full of people who claimed Christian values. Coming from the mouth of the child they had been taught to see as less than human, it carried devastating moral authority. Several women in the audience began weeping quietly, overcome by shame at their treatment of this remarkable little girl. Men who had participated in Garrett's campaign found themselves unable to meet Ruby's steady gaze. The territorial marshal chose that moment to enter the hall, his badge catching the lamplight. Sam had ridden hard to fetch the lawman, arriving just as the evening's revelations reached their peak. "Thomas Garrett," the marshal announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and intimidation." Garrett's remaining supporters melted away as the lawman approached with iron shackles. The settlers' grand crusade ended not with violence or triumph, but with the quiet click of metal restraints and the shuffle of defeated footsteps. As Garrett was led away, the community began the difficult process of confronting what they had almost become. The recordings had shown them a mirror they didn't like, but Ruby's grace offered them a path toward redemption. Dr. Harrison approached Esther with hat in hand, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Mrs. Williams, I owe you an apology. If Ruby or you ever need medical attention, I'll be honored to provide it." Similar apologies followed from other community members who recognized their failures of basic human decency. Not everyone would change. Obligation. Creating a marriage built on solid ground. "She's going to change the world someday," Esther said, watching their daughter guide another child through a difficult passage. Zeke nodded, his weathered face reflecting profound contentment. "She already has." The little girl who had once cowered under angry boots now stood as living proof that courage and truth could triumph over hatred and fear. Ruby Morrison carried herself with quiet confidence, knowing she was loved, protected, and valued for exactly who she was. In the end, the greatest victory belonged not to the adults who had fought their battles in public forums, but to a child whose simple dignity had shown an entire community the difference between what they were and what they could become.